Hello again, Struck12 Diablo Force Open Beta tests are almost here, and I'm already making some pre-launch Theorycrafted semi-builds that should be good for fresh into endgame characters when the game is fully launched. I also plan to evolve them in fully fledged builds when the game is released and keep them updated for when we get rebalance updates, new seasons, and in general patches of all kinds. This is one such build for the rogue class, and it has a very interesting name, Arrowstorm. Arrowstorm comes from multiple things such as the rain of arrows that we've taken, and such as one aspect that causes arrow storms, or as the game refers to them. I'll show you just actually I can't show you now, but you'll see it later. Creating arrow storms, 2 words, although the build is called with 1 word. And in general, yeah, it's a fun setup. It's definitely a fun setup. If you want to make it rain death from above, this is the build for you. Keep in mind that the beta test will only let us reach level 25 and only let us play in the first act slash zone fracture peaks, which limits us in various ways, such as only having up to the ultimate, not the capstone passive. In terms of skill trees, and when it comes to farming dungeons for legendary aspects, for the Codex of Power, we only have access to the first zone dungeons. Hopefully we can get aspects as drops, so we don't have to rely so you don't have to rely on just dungeons for legendary items, but it's definitely limiting us one way or another. So that's to be considered. I've used around 60 points for this build, specifically 63 points when making it. So instead of the full 100, so you have remaining 37 points on the way to 100 to spend on things that I've shown on the screen. I'll show you in a moment what I'm talking about. Regarding that, the build can be used as an endgame starter to jumpstart your endgame journey around level 50-60, and then eventually evolve it as you reach level 100. In the description there will be links to spreadsheets for those builds that I have shortlisted in those spreadsheets. The active skills I'm using, as well as various passives that I would recommend using for that setup, including some passives that you might want to consider investing. Even though I didn't put points into them on the way to 100, you might want to spend those points in those shortlisted skills. So I hope it's all clear. Buckle up and let's go. The Arrowstorm Rogue. The name comes from a couple of places. First of all, Rain of Arrows. Second of all, there's a modifier that makes us a legendary aspect that makes us cast arrow storms to trigger those arrow storms on the ground as hazards, which is pretty solid. And it's a purely ranged build with Heartseeker, Barrage, even Caltrops not being a ranged skill, but there wasn't a ranged agility skill, more about that in a moment. Then we use Stealth. I've included Dark Shroud if you want to invest into it instead of Stealth, more about that in a moment. We're using Code Imbue, and Arrowstorm has there's a legendary power that makes Arrowstorm apply all 3 imbues at the same time. As an option, you will be able to put points into Code, Shadow, and Poison. So if you feel like, okay, I have spare points, I'm gonna put 7 points into Shadow and 7 points into Poison, and now I'll have stronger imbues of all 3 types. And when I use Rain of Arrows, I will have stronger of all 3, but Rain of Arrows always benefits from all 3 imbues. I'm focusing on Code. You might want to focus on another element or all 3 elements at the same time. I'm using Rain of Arrows, as I mentioned, and we're using Precision. Let's go through them one by one. I'll also talk about some of those notes here. You can read them on the spreadsheet, link in the description as well. Now, basic skills, our resource generator, we want to get that, that resource, that energy. Heartseeker. Does damage and increases your crit strike chance against the enemies you have hit. by 3% for 4 seconds up to 15%, and this is additive, not multiplicative. And when it crit strikes, you gain 6% attack speed for 5 seconds, double if the enemy is already vulnerable. This build gets a lot of bonuses to enemies that are vulnerable, a lot of bonuses to enemies that are stunned, knocked down, whatever, and even bonuses to enemies that are frozen, although the frozen is not the main thing for us, it still does help. And freezing enemies eventually makes them vulnerable, so we do have this to consider. Now here I've taken this extra crit strike damage. So Heartseeker increases the crit strike damage the enemy takes, very good for bosses, up to 20%. So increases the crit strike chance and crit damage against that enemy on single target, big bosses, elites, etc. It will be nice. Barrage is great in my opinion for single target damage, but also it has ricochets, and that helps with clearing bigger areas of mobs. The ricochet chance is increased to 100% for arrows that damage a vulnerable enemy or critically strike an enemy, which is again all that vulnerable synergy here. See, this one can make enemies vulnerable, and if you're struggling to make enemies vulnerable as is, you could put that point from here to here. You can only have one of those two. This is how it works. I like this one, increased crit strike chance against crowd-controlled enemies. But I'm willing to sacrifice this, even though it's a huge sacrifice because this is additive, not multiplicative crit chance. It's very hard to come by additive crit chance from just skills and legendary aspects. But you could consider sacrificing this to get that extra vulnerability. Then sturdy, extra survivability for melee enemies. It's nice. Extra healing for enemies when they're nearby. Not that great of a synergy for this build, so I didn't put points into it. Critical striking an enemy gives you movement speed. I mean, not urgently needed, but if you feel like, okay, I'm gonna put points into it, sure. We have 37 points on the way to 100, and there's definitely room to put points here eventually on the way to 100. Caltrops. This brings us to Caltrops. Why take a trap on this build? Well, the other agility skills were not that great. I'm gonna quickly go to my other document so you can see what options we have. Shadow step requires dual wielded, dash requires dual wielded, and that's our choices. And I definitely preferred Caltrops. So not only is it great because it slows the enemies and it lasts for 6 seconds, but it also gives us increased crit strike chance against enemies inside caltrops and double this amount against vulnerable. And this is additive crit strike chance, so that's up to 30% chance if they're vulnerable and standing inside the caltrops. And also enemies take multiplicative increased damage from all sources each second they are in caltrops, which again, pretty solid bonuses. There's also this one, but I wouldn't take it. Weapon mastery, lovely bonuses. We're using bows or crossbows, and I'm assuming bows and crossbows are only two-handed. So that means we could either get increased damage to vulnerable or increased crit strike damage. The damage is a little less, but only applies to vulnerable. But we should have most of the enemies being vulnerable. And you don't need to rely on crits to trigger this, whereas with this one you have to be critting. But we should be critting plenty, so either way would be good for us. I'm not sure how it works, but most likely crossbows might have a bigger crit chance as base. It remains to be seen. So I put points there. Now stealth. I put points into stealth rather than dark shroud. But if you want dark shroud, it's okay to take countering dark shroud. But stealth gives you energy. It also when you break stealth, it makes enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds with the skill that breaks it. And if you use an AoE skill like Rain of Arrows to make all those enemies vulnerable, it's great. Even if you use caltrops on a bunch of enemies, it's still great. It's just good that you have ways to make enemies and not just a single, but a whole group of enemies vulnerable with that one. This one, it works with puncture. Puncture is not for the build. It's dual wielded, so not that great. So countering would be the option if you want that. if you want to use Dark Shroud. But I definitely recommend subverting stealth. Void is great and Malice is great. Extra damage to multiplicative, extra damage to healthy. Healthy enemies have over 80% of their life. Agile, using a skill with cooldown increases your dodge chance. Good for later on. I don't think that's that much needed early on. Both with the enhancement with mixed imbue weapon. Both imbued skills deal multiplicative increased damage to frozen enemies. You freeze an enemy by cheating it X amount of times and eventually it builds up to a freeze. If you think you don't like this, then crit strike chance with cold imbued skills have 20% chance to instantly freeze enemies, which is still good, but I'd rather take that extra damage. We have range, let's have the extra damage and just dodge as much as possible, stay away as much as possible. Deadly Venom and Shadow Crash you could consider if you invest into the other imbues. Again, since we apply all three imbues, investing into more than one is actually acceptable for this build. Rigid Finesse, in my opinion, must have because we're going cold. You deal multiplicative increased damage to shield enemies. This bonus increases to 10%, so doubles, against frozen enemies. And shield enemies have their movement speed further reduced. I did not put points into the upgrade. I don't think it's that much needed. But if you feel like it, take it. Obviously, you have plenty of points on the way to 100. And I don't see why not put the points here on the way to 100. Rain of Arrows maxed out. Obviously, second wave knocks down enemies, works great with some of the aspects we'll show you. Imbuement effects applied by Rain of Arrows are stronger, which is solid thing. And now we have an innervation, up to 20% chance to gain 5 energy as a Wookiee hit. And then every 100 energy you spend grants you increased Wookiee hit chance, which would increase this one. You may not want to put points here. You may not want to put even points here if you think you have plenty of energy generation. I would recommend at least putting the point here, maybe removing those there. Non-physical damage you deal has 5% increased Wookiee hit chance. This is definitely great eventually because we will be doing cold damage with the imbue and with the other imbues that apply to that one skill. This one's not bad eventually. We will be moving a lot, but we also have to stop to shoot. So there is that to consider. That one's also not bad. I mean, we have spare points on the way to 100, putting the points here and here, not a bad choice. Precision is amazing. Critical strikes with range skills grant you precision, which is you gain 4% multiplicative increased crit strike chance damage per stack of precision, up to maximum 20% multiplicative. When you have what, 5 stacks? Is that 5 stacks? To get 20% increased multiplicative crit damage. When you reach maximum precision, your next ranged skill is guaranteed crit strike. That means every fifth ranged hit will be a guaranteed crit strike and will do increased 40% multiplicative crit damage on top of this 20%, I'm assuming. Which is lovely. And then you consume all of the precision stacks and start building again. This would be amazing if you play it right and use Heartseeker to build up those stacks and then unleash something like Rain of Arrows. That would be great. Make sure you unleash Rain of Arrows with those 5 stacks. So maybe use Heartseeker 4 times, or maybe use Heartseeker 5 times. If you use it 4 times, maybe do Barrage. I don't know if that's... see, it means critical strikes with range skills. So obviously you need to crit strike. It doesn't work immediately. So you have to be very precise with when you cast your ultimate if you want to cast it with the maximum precision. Because if you have something else tickling damage on an enemy, and that actually crits and resets the cooldown and not the cooldown, the stacks, then it might not work as great as one would want. But let's move on to the legendary powers. Legendary aspects, legendary powers. I'll quickly try to explain what they are. When you hunt enemies, kill the enemies, they drop items, and those items can be legendary. You can also get legendary items from various things like chests and other various sources of wood. And legendary items have a legendary aspect on them, which you can take from one legendary item, put it on another legendary item, or you can even make a yellow item, a rare item, legendary by taking the aspect of one legendary, putting it on that rare item, and promoting that rare item to a new legendary one. There's also ways to take aspects from dungeons. More about that in a moment. Keep in mind there are restrictions of what you can do when it comes to legendary aspect placement from one item to another, and the limitation is kind of simple. There are 5 categories: defensive, offensive, mobility, utility, and resource. So as long as the item you took the power is in the same category as the item you're trying to give the power to, there's gonna be no problem. So you can take a resource category power aspect and put it on another item that fits. So helmet, ring, and amulet in this case. So there's the 5 categories. If you're getting super unlucky and you can't get the legendary aspect power as a drop, you have an alternative to go into a dungeon and finish that dungeon, kill the final boss of the dungeon, and that will unlock a legendary aspect. A specific legendary aspect will be unlocked from that dungeon into your Codex of Power, which is user interface. But here is the twist. The twist is that items unlocked from dungeons, I mean not items, legendary aspects unlocked from dungeons, will be the bare minimum possible roll. So if the roll is between 5 and 10% of certain effect to trigger, the dungeon version will give you 5%. But if you get it from an item, you can get anything between the 5 and 10%. That's example numbers, obviously. For example, on this thing here, 40 to 50%. If 40 is the minimum, you will always be getting the 40% version if you go to Kyrgyzstan and whatever dungeon this drops from. Whereas if you get it as a drop, you could get the 50%. Now let's go through the best in SWAT things I recommend for this setup. Here is a short list of all the things that could work well, could synergize. I have put points where something is a must-have, something is strongly recommended. There are notes. You can see this note here. This note here is for those two, by the way. But let's go through it. Umbro, Shared Misery, Slitting Imbuements, Might, Ghost Walker, Pummeling Retribution, Branching Volleys, and aspect of Arrowstorms. I'm gonna start with the resource and the mobility. Let's go mobility first. Ghost Walker is shit hits the fan. There's too many enemies around me. I wanna move freely through them. I'm already under 40% life. I think this is better than this extra mobility. If you do like the extra mobility, it's up to you. But I would instead of movement speed, I'd rather have this one. So even though it's not a must-have, it's something I would recommend picking. For Shared Misery, it's one of my favorite ones. I think almost all of my builds so far have included it, because crowd control is that good, and spreading crowd control, it's even better. Especially on a ranged build where you wanna make sure the enemies are sword, shield, whatever. When you hit the crowd controlled enemy, there's up to X% chance that crowd control effects spread to another unaffected nearby enemy. Not a must-have, strongly recommended though, especially for this build. I've put it in the chest. Normally I put it in the amulet for the 50% effectiveness, but you'll see why I didn't do it this time. Now, Umbro. Umbro is a good synergy with the Shared Misery. Umbro pretty much gives you resources when you crowd control an enemy. Gives you that energy. So this one is great synergy, and we have so many ways to crowd control enemies with this build. Umbro, not taking Umbro and taking something else like Ravenous would be kind of not that great, and I'd rather take more offensive stuff instead of taking Ravenous and Umbro. Now, aspect of might is the one I decided to take when it comes to defensive. You have to take one defensive because on pens only defensive can go. And we do have options such as cheats aspect, siphon protection, uncanny resilience, but I decided to go for might. Basic skills grant you damage reduction, so when you use Heartseeker you get that damage reduction. This one's also not bad. Enemies afflicted with damage over time effect deal less damage to you. But this is less of a number than this one. This one is 25. This one is 20%, not sure how far it goes. And you need the damage over time. And sure, you will be causing with Rain of Arrows the poison damage over time. But other than that, you won't be causing much damage over time. So I'd rather take that. Now, Slitting Imbuements. Let's go for that one. Slitting Imbuements is lovely. Your Rain of Arrows is always affected by all imbuement skills at once. Since this one doesn't benefit from any additional effectiveness, you don't need to put it on an amulet or a two-handed weapon. Next we have Pummeling. Pummeling is in the amulet slot. Why? Well, I want this 40 to 50% to be doubled. Not that to be boosted by 50%. So 40 becomes 60, 50 becomes 75%, and so on. Another thing to consider is aspect of arrows, but I put aspect of Arrowstorms, which is this one. I put it on the 100% boost, so I put this on the actual double slot and the two-handed weapon. So this 10% chance will probably become 20% chance when it's here. This N physical damage will become N times 2. You can have up to 5 active Arrowstorms. I think will still remain 5. The 3 seconds I think might go up to 6, but most likely it will still remain 3 seconds with that 100% effectiveness. I think the chance and the damage will increase only. In any case, if you go, if there is a one-handed weapon that is ranged, you might want to consider having some changes here. I've put some notes. Let's talk about Retribution. Retribution synergizes great with Pummeling and with other things. Again, this is 30% damage to stunt. Additive. This is multiplicative. But I still would rather get this one in the amulet slot instead of that one, but you could swap them out. Those together, thanks to our imbuement, we will be doing a lot of freezing and stuff. And yeah, I think it's lovely. I think it's lovely that we have that. And we also have knockdown due to Rain of Arrows. In case you whack enough vulnerability, you can consider this one with caltrops. By the way, branching volleys. I didn't talk about that. Barrage's arrows have an extra chance to split into 2 arrows whenever they ricochet. And that pretty much covers all the aspects. Again, I've put a lot of reserves, alternatives. So before you get the best in SWAT stuff, you can experiment, test different things. And if you like those other things, you might as well keep them permanently. To get notified when I upload more content like this one or other builds and guides for Wooter and not so Wooter games, you can subscribe to my channel and hit that bell button to not miss out on notifications. As well as keep in mind there's something called memberships on YouTube, which lets you be a paying member for my channel to get access to perks such as emotes and badges made by me, as well as the option to get one-on-one tutoring for the very basics of Adobe Photoshop, Premiere and After Effects. And memberships can be cancelled at any time if you no longer wanna be a member. Thanks for watching all the way until the end. Struck up, keep it cool until next time, and goodbye.